So, hi friends, we were discussing how the market behaves in the presence of externalities, and we said that whenever there is a difference between the private cost and the social cost, or private benefit and the social benefit, the market outcomes may not be efficient, right? So, we also said that what would happen to the market outcomes would involve underproduction of goods or services, as we had taken an example of vaccines. A market outcome would be an underproduction of vaccines because those are giving us positive externalities. Uh, Similarly, when we talked about negative externalities like production of polluting cars, we said that uh, in because there is a difference between the private cost and the social cost, it results in the overproduction of polluting goods because in case of negative externalities, right? So this is how the market fails. How the market fails? It underproduces the goods which are desirable, it underproduces the services which are desirable, whereas it overproduces the goods which are not desirable from the environmental angle or from the social angle, right? So how do we take care of this externalities, right? So once again, we will have a look at the graph which we had discussed. This is again the same graph which we discussed, which is basically the demand curve and the supply curve. So you see the blue line being the demand curve and the pink line being the supply curve. Uh, this is the case of negative externalities, and the point A is the equilibrium in absence of social cost. The demand curve and supply curve they meet and give you QA. When that happens, QA is actually then equilibrium point where we have considered only the marginal private costs and the marginal private benefit. So wherever the marginal private cost and marginal private benefit equals, that is the equilibrium. But we said that that equilibrium point or that equilibrium output is not desirable because it is overproduced. The number of polluting cars is more. So what we need to do is that we need to shift the curve from marginal private cost to a marginal social cost, and in order to shift that, we need to use an approach which is called as a Pigouvian taxation approach, right? So what is the Pigouvian tax? So before that, let me just show you the shifted curve. You see that the pink curve has shifted to a green curve, where the marginal social cost has been considered now, the social value has been considered, and we get a new point, point B, and the point B is socially desirable or economically efficient output. Now, why has this happened? Will it happen on its own? No, it won't happen on its own. It would happen because of government intervention. And this idea was suggested by Arthur Pigou in his research paper, which we'll be discussing again in detail. And that is, he's saying that in order to take care of negative externalities, we need to tax the polluting goods, right? So you see here, as the graph shows you here clearly, that he is suggesting that the difference, what is the difference? The difference between the marginal social cost and the marginal private cost, that difference that is the external cost, has to be levied on the producer, and that becomes the Pigouvian tax. So you see that the shift from the curve from the marginal private cost to the marginal social cost can happen by taxing the producer or the consumer. So in this case, we see that there is a taxing of the producer, and the curve, the supply curve shifts from S1 to S2. Okay, and both the curves, they are basically the same. I just shown you two different curves so that you get better insights. So in the second curve, what you see is that uh, the yellow band, the yellow band is the increase in the revenue of the government because of taxation, right? And the vertical line between the marginal social cost and marginal private cost, that vertical line would reflect the amount of taxation which is called as a Pigouvian taxation. Why it is called as a Pigouvian taxation? Because this taxation has been proposed by an economist, Arthur Pigou, right? So both the curves which I had shown you here, they basically say that in order to move towards the social optimal, rather than the market optimal, we need to tax the producer for production of negative goods, and that taxation has to be equal to the difference between the marginal social cost and marginal private cost. Similarly, in case of positive externality, uh, because positive externality would give you a more benefit than what the market is going to give us, we need to provide a subsidy, right? So here you see that again, there has to be a shift from private marginal benefit curve to a socially marginal benefit curve, right? So you see that the pink curve or the orange curve shifts to a blue curve, and that shifting has to be equal to Pigouvian subsidy, right? So the difference which you see over here, the vertical line, the vertical gap between the socially marginal benefit and private benefit curves, that vertical gap is equal to the Pigouvian subsidy. Why it is called as a Pigouvian subsidy? Because it is the government intervention in order to shift the curve from the private benefit to the social benefit, right? And with that tax, with that subsidy, and we had taken an example of vaccines. Suppose the government incentivizes the production of vaccines, then how much incentive or how much subsidy will the government give to the producer? It will be equal to the difference between the social marginal benefit curve and the private benefit curve. Okay, so that vertical distance becomes the Pigouvian subsidy. So private benefit curve does not shift on its own to a social benefit curve. The government has to intervene in the form of Pigouvian subsidies so that we reach towards the socially optimal number of vaccines or any positive goods, right? So this is how we need to understand the Pigouvian taxation and Pigouvian subsidy. To summarize, we can say that Pigouvian taxation is the government intervention in order to shift the curve so that the negative externality is taken care of, and Pigouvian subsidy is again a government intervention to shift the curve from the private benefit to the social benefit in order to take care of positive externality. So subsidy for positive externality and taxation for negative externality.